2018, Jesus Christ, season setting meeting. Just a few guidelines. Please silence your cell phones and other gadgets that you have. There are blue sheets in the back. If anybody would wish to comment on any item or just in general, if you could fill this out. We do take public comment at the end if you didn't get one, but this helps us put names in the minutes of who's given us comment. I think that's it. All right, I'd like to start the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The members of the commission had a chance to review the minutes from the March meeting. Do you have a motion to approve those? So moved. Second. Mr. Doobie and Galen. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes have been approved. Next, Director Talbot will give his director's report.
Good morning, Mr. President, members of the commission. Welcome. Today and tomorrow are very, very busy days for the commission and the department, and I guess I would just like to recognize that the recommendations that you all will be reviewing and approving today come from many, many thousands of hours of work on behalf of the employees of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, whether that's checking animals in the field, doing surveys both on ground, on foot, on snow machine, from helicopters and airplanes, managing our wildlife, not to mention the many, many hours of modeling those populations, looking at harvest survey data, and meeting with the public in hundreds of meetings across this state, and hundreds of informal meetings with sportsmen and landowners. So this is kind of the culmination, if you will, for the year of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and certainly most folks think that hunting season is where it's at, but what we do here today certainly has a huge impact on the opportunities that folks will have during the coming hunting season. So I'd just like to recognize that there has been an incredible amount of work on behalf of our employees and behalf of the public to provide those recommendations today for your consideration. As far as the director's report, since our last meeting, I attended and serve as the vice chair of the Governor's GIS Advisory Board. We had a meeting and are moving forward with GIS on a statewide level. Several legislative activities. Probably the most fun and foremost is that myself and Deputy Director John Kennedy and Deputy Director Scott Smith host a get-together each and every year after the legislative session to recognize the efforts and the help from all of our employees, whether they be staff employees or employees from the field that come in, and we get those folks together and thank them for all of their hard work during the session. We did that. Travel, Recreation, and Wildlife has sent out their calendar, and they will be meeting on May 10th and 11th in Torrington, August 30th and 31st in Evanston, and November 8th and 9th in Cheyenne. And we have not heard back what topics will be selected by Management Council at this time, but we do have a list of potential topics which include high-tech hunting, and that would specifically look at giving the Commission authority to regulate various forms of technology and weapons and ammunition. Preference points, there has been discussion about the expiration of preference points and whether if an individual doesn't apply for 2 years or 5 years or whatever that time frame is. Currently in statute, it's 2 years. So if that happens, if this gets selected as an interim topic, we will be looking at that as well. And then there is a section that's simply called General Updates and Reports from Game and Fish. And I think we have a lot to report specifically with our strategic planning, our budget, our public outreach. We normally provide travel, recreation, and wildlife and endangered species updated at their meetings. And so we think that we'll have the opportunity to highlight some of the department's work there. And the last topic that has been suggested is interagency efficiencies, looking at travel and tourism, game and fish, and state parks, and see if there's ways that we can streamline our efforts on communicating the outdoor recreation message. And recall that the governor in the last, I guess it's been about 18 months, put together a recreation task force, which the Game and Fish Department was a part of, and we'll be moving that agenda forward. I had the pleasure to host the 35th anniversary of the Conservation Stamp Art Show, and this year was the first year that we had a duplicate species since we started that, and we felt that with all of the impetus on mule deer, the public interest on mule deer, that we would redo the mule deer, and we had 106 entries in the Conservation Stamp Art Contest, and that was won by Ann Newby out of Afton, Wyoming. And we had a new venue this year, and I think that the show itself was far above and beyond what we've done in the past. Just to remind the commission that next year the stamped species will be the Colorado River cutthroat trout. We'd like to remind the commission and of all the work and planning that's gone into the Outdoor Expo. That's only a few weeks away on the 17th to the 19th at the Casper Event Center. We have almost 2,000 students signed up. We have almost half of this agency, 190 employees that have volunteered or will be there. We have 34 partners to date that will help share and manage our message about conservation and outdoor activities. We have 90 volunteers and 20 sponsors. So I hope that you can all attend that. Strategic planning, we continue to move the needle forward on our strategic plan based on the public input that we have. I attended several of those meetings since our last commission meeting, and I look forward to having a strategic plan that will guide the department in the next 5 to 10 years. The commission has been very involved in that process, and I would encourage your continued involvement and engagement, and our next meeting on that will be the 29th and 30th of May, and if there are any of the commissioners that are interested in that, please do so. We've had Commissioner Culver and Commissioner Crank engaged in that, and other commissioners that would like to sit in on that process as we prepare the documents for the commission's approval. We would certainly appreciate that. I attended the badge pinning ceremony for 5 new game wardens who completed their 14-week Peace Officer Basic at the Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy. In addition to that, I also attended a ceremony where our Chief Game Warden, Brian Nesvik, was pinned as the Brigadier General for the National Guard in the state of Wyoming, and he assumed responsibilities of commanding our forces here in Wyoming. That was an honor and a privilege to be there, and that was also attended by Mr. Pat Crank, but Brian is now the Brigadier General for the state of Wyoming. I attended 2 regional meetings. One was the Pinedale-Jackson Arm in Pinedale, and also the Laramie Regional Team meeting to visit with them about happenings, primarily the strategic planning process, and answered any questions that folks in the agency had. Certainly an update on legislation that passed this past session questions about that. I did stop in my travels and check on the Whiskey Basin Conservation Camp. I think you will be quite pleased at the outcome of that. I was very pleased. In talking to the contractor, he told me that things were on track and moving forward quite nicely, but I took liberty to walk through many of the cabins and talk to some of the subcontractors, and let's just say they weren't quite as optimistic that we'll be done on time, but they said they were working very, very hard. While I was there, I stopped in at the Du Bois Hatchery, and actually since our last meeting, I have stopped in and visited with several landowners throughout the state that kind of renewed some old acquaintances and said hi to folks along the way. Right after our last commission meeting, myself and several other employees went down to Denver and participated in the St. Patrick's Day Parade. I think that you all have seen examples of what has happened or the new approach to the wraps on our fish planting trucks and wrapping those, I guess they used to be fairly hospital green colored trucks with colors of fish and messages on them to encourage fishing. But we partnered with the Casper Area Development on trying to attract more fishermen into Wyoming, and I know that Commissioner Crank doesn't want any more fishermen into Wyoming, but certainly from an opportunity perspective and from a fiscal perspective, we certainly want to welcome folks to Wyoming to fish. I've been very active in the chronic wasting disease world, trying to set up both it started as a tri-state meeting. It looks like there will be about 8 states now very interested to sit down. We're going to try to do that first part of June and talk about many of the issues with chronic wasting disease and basically in the Rocky Mountain region, and also have been participating in conference calls from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, specifically on issues on transportation and recall that the captive cervid industry in many portions of the country is a significant issue in the movement of chronic wasting disease throughout the country. Myself and several staff members attended the North American Wildlife Conference in Norfolk, Virginia, and I would just like to remind the Commission that the department, and whether it be John Kennedy or Scott Smith or Brian Nesvik or myself or Rennie McKay, we are in charge of or chair many committees at the national level and are engaged in a significant amount of work, everywhere from wildlife disease to sage grouse to what we're doing with information and education, wildlife law enforcement, et cetera. But if you sit in on that meeting, the references and the reports from Wyoming are fairly impressive as far as our engagement on setting conservation policy in this country. I met with representatives of the Pathfinder Ranch and are working on moving forward with collaborative wildlife management and habitat improvement. Myself and Scott Edberg had the privilege of going to the Wyoming Outfitters Association meeting, and we had about a 2-hour block of their time in the morning where we were able to interact with them on many issues, everything from chronic wasting disease to commission activities and previous legislation. I had a brief opportunity to attend the Bowhunters of Wyoming convention. That's one of the meetings I try to make every year, and they are a very active partner in many aspects of wildlife management, but that was here in Lander. In addition to that, I've met with Diane Schober and the Director of State Parks, Mr. Darren Westby, regarding the potential of where we're going with the travel, recreation, and wildlife interim about coordinating our activities and looking for efficiencies between our 3 agencies. And in addition to that, I have had several meetings with members of the Wyoming Wildlife Foundation and looking at the future of that foundation and where we're going. In conclusion today, Mr. President and members of the commission, I was in the office yesterday morning, and Kate Grant, our HR person, was pestering me to get a bunch of signatures on documents. And one of the documents that I signed yesterday, and I think that there's probably been a significant amount of planning on this, was a 40-year service recognition for one of our employees, Mr. Steve Sharon. And I don't know if you're aware or not, but Mr. Sharon's last day is tomorrow. And I think he tried to sneak that in on us without knowing what's going on. But I'd like to recognize Steve Sharon for 40 years with Wyoming. With that, Mr. President, members of the commission, I take any questions there. Answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions of Director?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Osterlin?
President Anselmi, Commissioners, Director Talbot. This morning I want to take a few minutes, since today is Steve's last day, excuse me, and we can't do it tomorrow, to recognize Steve on behalf of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for an award. So Steve, if you want to come up. I'd like to say a few things before we get in and present the award on outstanding career within the department. As Director Talbot mentions, Steve has been an employee for the department for 40 years, which is quite an accomplishment. He started in 1978 as a fish health lab technician for a short stint, and then 9 years in various hatcheries around the states. And after that, 1988, he climbed the ladder and became the fish hatchery coordinator for the state. And then in 1998, for the last 20 years, he's been a fish culture supervisor. You know, when I first got to know Steve, he kept on mentioning science in relation to fish aquaculture. And as I began working with him, I got to realize what he meant by that. There is a lot of science that goes into growing quality fish and healthy fish. And Steve and his crew have certainly accomplished it. If you go to any hatchery around the state, you can see the dedication and the professionalism of those employees and the quality of fish that they produce there. Nationally, they're recognized, our program is recognized as one of the best in the nation. In addition to that recognition, Steve has spent a lot of time developing relationships nationally that have helped produce trades with numerous states to the amount of about 1.5 million cool and warm water species of fish are brought into the state nationally or annually for our recreational use in the state of Wyoming. Everything from walleye to crappie, small or largemouth bass, catfish, those type of species. In addition, nationally, Steve has developed recognition in his dedication and his passion for fish health. So in 1997, Steve was appointed to the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies DAWG, or Drug Approval Working Group. And since that time, he has worked doggedly. That was a joke. With fish health and with drugs. Not him personally, but. So I wanted to read a little excerpt that the staff at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies produced for this award. Since Steve was retiring, they asked us to present it to him since there wouldn't be time. So as I mentioned, Steve started his work on the board in 1997. He was asked to serve as chairman of DOG in 2005 and continued in that role until stepping down after his last meeting in February of 2018. Over the last 30 years, Steve played a unique role and served as a key liaison between state fish and wildlife agencies, commercial and private industry, and federal agencies. Excuse me. Because of Steve's dedication and knowledge, he surfaced as a critical player when it came to time to ensure that the state agencies had the ability to utilize investigational new animal drugs to treat fish effectively, and federal agencies had adequate funding to support drug approvals, and that state professionals had a clear understanding of Food and Drug Administration regulations and guidelines and impacted their aquaculture operations. Through Steve's consistent and outstanding leadership, OFWA has made steady progress obtaining approval for drugs needed by private and public fish culture operations throughout the United States. Steve has also served as OFWA's appointee to the Federal Joint Subcommittee on Aquaculture, representing the state's interests relevant to the National Aquaculture Improvement Act. Steve was recognized with OFWA's Special Recognition Award in 2012 for his continued outstanding work for the association and its members. With that, Steve, I'd like to present you with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Certificate of Achievement.
Tell us some stories from 40 years ago. What have you seen in 40 years?
What have I seen in 40 years as far as, well, as far as the hatchery section, a huge amount of change because of fighting with disease and having to do a lot of construction to offset that problem. But I think the other thing that I've seen is just the outstanding dedication to managing the resource and working with it as we move forward. It became more and more prevalent in things that I've seen now. The employees, at least in the hatchery section, really took on the science and did their best to develop the best product they could for the state and the public. So that's about the easiest way to say it.
Well, I think we have one of the best fish culture divisions in the country, and a lot of that's because of you, and I appreciate it very much.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. President, can I say one thing? I've had the opportunity actually to know Steve since high school, although he's considerably older than me. But I do want to say, you know, in attending WAFA conventions, it's quite obvious the respect that other states have for Steve's work. And under his leadership, we have built a hatchery and rearing station program that is second to none in this country. And I think that's reflected in the fishing opportunities that Wyoming currently provides. And really appreciate his leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, before we, Mr. Springmeyer, I'd like to recognize Representative Allen here at Lander. Welcome, Representative. And Commissioner Wally Walski from Goshen County, who came quite a ways. Thanks again for coming. I've got one blue. Would you? Okay. God. Representative Allen, you had a, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate being here. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I just wanted to give you a very quick update on what we're going to look at for, excuse me, let me back up. My name is Jim Allen. I'm the chairman of the House Travel, Recreation, and Wildlife Committee. And so what I'd like to do is invite you to the next TRW committee meeting, our first one for this interim, which will be in Torrington, May 10th, if you can and want to. And so the topics that we're going to look at that we've had approval from Management Council and that we worked through the process during the session and at the end of the session with our joint committee is to look at and possibly consider legislation to regulate or to provide you, the commission, the statutory authority to regulate hunting methods and high-tech weapons. We realize that you already have the statutory authority to regulate weapons, but I can't find anywhere in there where you have the authority to specifically regulate methods, whether or not we want to go there. And the reason for this review, let's say, is, for example, we've got technology is evolving quicker than we can legislate. And so we have, for example, in the Wyoming range, we have people that come up and find those trophy bucks, and they basically sell that information. They take pictures of them with high or very long range telephoto lenses, and they mark the location, and they sell that information online. We don't know if, well, anyway, so we're going to look at that. But the problem is we're always behind the 8 ball, and so maybe what we need to do is look at the broader picture. As technology evolves, maybe we need to really think about that. So I would really like some feedback from the commission. You can think about that, send me an email, or show up at the meeting, or talk to the staff. And we've got until the 2019 session, but we'll be working on that. We'll be looking at that. We'll have 3 interim committee meetings between now and then. The second one will be in Evanston towards the end of August, and the last one will be in August 30th and 31st. And the last one will be in Cheyenne on November 8th and 9th, I believe. So anyway, that's one of the things we want to look at is high-tech methods and high-tech weaponry. And I know that you have done that. You have a 57-page report. I've read that. And I believe that you've asked the department to come back in November for your final recommendation on what you're going to do. So I think we can work hand in hand between the legislature and you, the commission, to look at that. The other thing that we did during the session and that we'll be doing going forward is I brought a budget amendment to link the websites from all the agencies that might have anything to do with outdoor recreation or tourism, you know, that kind of thing. And that would include the Game and Fish Department's website. So if we can cross-link state parks, tourism, YDOT, because they have aeronautics, and the Game and Fish, maybe some other, maybe even the State Outfitter Board, maybe there's some other agencies that we should cross-link so that people can find information easier. If they want to come to Wyoming and recreate or hunt or go mountain biking or whatever, they can find that. So other than that, that's kind of a look forward, and if I would stand for questions, but otherwise, thank you for having me. Okay,
Any
thank
questions?
you.
Thank you. Mr. Allen? Mr. Bremeyer?
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot, it's my pleasure today to be here for the next brief agenda topic that we have. And so this year, we're going to start off and we'll go through each of the chapter regulations and discuss the emerging issues, changes subsequent to the public comments that we received. And after each chapter regulation, if it's your pleasure, we'll take a break, and then you take a break in the presentation, and you can discuss the regulation, and then vote on that regulation, take public comment, and that'll be between each chapter regulation, like we did last year. So before we get started, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the process that we use, and so we follow as Scott alluded to earlier, we have a pretty substantial process that we follow that involves a large amount of public input, and that input is gathered and formulated into our season proposals throughout the year. It's through field contacts, it's the post-hunting season meetings that some of the regions hold, and it's meetings with landowners, sportsmen, and other stakeholders. And we review harvest survey information, and we formulate those into regulation, proposed regulation changes. And then in March, we have the public meetings that you're well aware of and some of you have attended. And then some of the regions also do some landowner and public attitude surveys as they evaluate population objectives and where those herds are at relative to public support and landowner support. And then finally, following those public meetings, we look at the comments, and we make, the field managers start to consider some changes that are the public may have raised as concerns. And when we get into the specific species, probably have somebody come up and we'll have a hunt area map too that you can refer to on the screen over here, and hopefully you guys will be able to see that. So in 2018, just a summary of the public meetings that we've held across the state. We've had over 42 different public meetings, and this graph on the screen here is broken down by the regions, so you can see kind of your specific regions. But overall, 42 meetings. We had almost 850 people attending those meetings, and we received 114 written comments. The Laramie region tried to do some social media, and they did a broadcast online, and they had an additional 18 to 25 people that were logged into that at different times as well. So once you look at the public commenting that we received over this period of the time when the folks could provide comment, we've had a total of 354 comments from folks. That includes online and the comments during the regulation meetings that the regions had, and those comments are all in your book by species, and so you can scan back through the different chapter regulations, summarize those comments. And then this graph just basically identifies the category that those comments pertain to as we received them. Some of the statewide major themes that we had this year: elk harvest and hunter satisfaction remains very high across the state. There's large numbers of elk in some of these areas, and we're starting to hear landowner concerns regarding the densities of elk that they have on some of their lands. There's continued concern for Wyoming's moose herds, which we often have talked with each of you about the moose herds in Wyoming, and we'll touch on that a little bit more during this presentation. Mule deer and pronghorn herds have increased east of the Continental Divide, and you'll see some increases in license quotas for those respective chapter regulations. There's also concern regarding conservative mule deer and pronghorn seasons in western Wyoming following the severe winter that we experienced last year. And you'll see when we get into chapter 6 that harvest levels dropped off a little bit last year because of that severe winter. And we also have interest from the public regarding maintaining archery hunting opportunities during the special archery season. And that specifically refers to some of those areas around Cody where we had some direction we were going to move towards separating the special archery seasons from the Type 9 license holders. And some of our publics were pretty opinionated over that, and so we changed that season based on that comment, and I'll cover that in Chapter 7 a little bit more. So starting off with our first regulation is Chapter 2. So within that Chapter 2, so it's the first tab within your booklet, the highlighted changes in there, and I'll talk a little bit about the errata sheets that you guys have, and that is the sheet that has the yellow highlights on it. It's by chapter, and it just addresses, so like Chapter 2 is just a one paragraph, and it shows kind of what we changed following public comment. So just in general, overall, the Chapter 2, we revised some of the definitions. We added the duck stamp language so that we defined duck stamp, and that's to provide more customer service for our publics that try to purchase a stamp. In the past few years, they were unable to buy stamps at some post offices, or they may be going hunting on a Sunday and weren't able to purchase a stamp. And so we're going to accommodate the interests of our publics to be able to acquire a stamp through an online venue. And so that definition just kind of clarifies that. We added Chapter 47, gray wolf, into the the chapter 2 as well. That's just to clarify that the commission will be setting, the seasons for chapter 47 like the other species. Clarified the definition of spike elk, and then we modified the definition of public road or highway as it pertains to this department administered lands or commission administered lands. And then finally, at the end of chapter 2, we added a new section to address chronic wasting disease submission of samples, mandatory submission. So if the department desires to have a higher sampling effort within a specific portion of the state, we have the ability to require a mandatory submission of that CWD sample to help achieve an adequate sample size in an area. It's not that we're going to do that across the board, but it's designed to help us achieve sample sizes in specific areas. And that concludes the I guess this part of chapter 2 presentation, and the department recommends that the commission adopt or move forward with adopting this regulation as proposed.
Any questions, Doug? Chapter 2? Need a motion to approve chapter 2?
So moved. Mr. President, should we take public comment on each section before we vote on it?
Anybody have any comments or, I don't know. Anybody want to speak of just chapter 2? I don't have any sheets, but that's fine. Jim, you've got a sheet here. Where do you want to be? At the end? We'll make you sit here all day. You're going to be here all day. Seeing no comment from the audience, moved and seconded to approve chapter 2. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Chapter 2 passes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the commission, and Director Talbot. We'll move on to chapter 5. Try and get this thing to work. So, chapter 5, so the pronghorn antelope hunting seasons, and again, we'll move forward to the end of this one, and then we can take a break, and the commission, that's at their pleasure, can vote on this regulation. And again, the map is over to the side of the room here, and you can see we'll reference a few different hunt areas as we move forward through this. I don't know if I can get something going with this.
There's a school next door. Go find a little kid. He can get that thing running for you.
I keep shutting it off and starting it over to see if it'll. Batteries are bad in it. Okay. So each species will have a sheet that looks like this, and this is the changes to the limited quota licenses that are available for that particular species by region. And I'm not going to get down into the weeds too much, but we can refer back to them if you guys have any specific questions. But what I'd like to do is just talk by region to give you an idea on what those changes have been as a total. So in the Jackson region, there's no change with the proposed limit quota licenses. Cody region has a total decrease of 75 licenses, and you can see the breakdown of how that quota has been changed and by the type of license. Sheridan region increased by 850 licenses this year. Green River increased by 675. Laramie, 675. Lander by 900. And the Casper region increased their antelope licenses that are available by 2,250. So a pretty significant increase. And when you look at statewide, that when you add up all those different types of licenses, that's 5,300 more licenses than we had last year. And last year we harvested 42,294. antelope, and hunters experienced a 94% hunter success. Looking at the harvest trend over the last 10 years, you can see that we did have a decline starting in 2011 that dropped off, and we're starting to see that statewide population come back a little bit. So we'd like to see that get back up more towards that 50,000 animal range, and populations are starting to rebound across the state, and it's looking pretty encouraging at this point. So looking at the common themes and concerns and issues that were raised at some of the public meetings, overall for pronghorn, we've received a lot of positive comment and positive feedback regarding the population increases and the availability of licenses being improved for a lot of our constituents. And so folks are pretty happy with that. We did make one minor change in Area 55, which is just south of the interstate, west of Rollins, and we bumped that quota up slightly in this, just in the last few weeks, just considering population changes and some of the things going on with that herd unit. Emerging issues with pronghorn across the state, we really don't have anything going on that we're too concerned about at this point with our populations, and things seem to be, the populations seem to be improving, and opportunity is getting improved as well within those herds. And so with that concludes the Chapter 5 presentation, and the department recommends that the regulation be adopted as proposed. And with that, I stand for any questions.
Any questions of Doug? For antelope? Anyone in the audience like to address Chapter 5, antelope? There being none, to hear a motion to approve Chapter 5?
So moved.
Moved by Galen and seconded by Mr. Doobie. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Chapter 5 passes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Director Talbot, members of the commission. Next chapter we have is Chapter 6, and it's mule deer. And we'll go ahead and get a map on the screen up there for you guys. And you'll also have one in the tab, the first after the tab in your notebook, you'll show a map, and the non-resident regions are within that first page as well. So the first thing, again, this is consistent with the previous chapter that I presented. We start off with the changes to the limited quota licenses, and keep in mind that a lot of our deer areas are general license, so there's not a lot of change in some of the regions because most of the opportunity is through a general license structure. So with Jackson, there's no change. Cody region, basically the changes they've had between their type 1s and type 6 and 7s, it was a net total of 0 for the change. They modified things slightly within those hunt areas that are in the Cody region. Sheridan region, overall they increased 150. Green River increased to 275 licenses. Laramie increased 150. Lander 175 in their limit quotas, hunt areas. And then Casper increased, and this is a change in, they combined some of the species licenses they had. So it looks like a overall increase in the mule deer licenses by 3,850, but in actuality it's, when you combine the whitetail and the mule deer, it's the same number of licenses. They just added both species could be taken. So they liberalized that license type to allow hunters to take either a mule deer or a whitetail deer on the type 6s and 7 licenses. Last year it was just for whitetail, but they've got enough concern with deer numbers on private lands that they've enhanced that hunting opportunity for either species to address concerns within. And that's primarily in that Region A country, the north part of the state, hunt areas 1 through 3. And when I show the whitetail deer chart like that, you'll see that there's a loss of hunting licenses there because we made them for both species. Again, statewide mule deer numbers for limit quota licenses went to 4,595 over last year. And last year we had 27,000 mule deer harvested with 54% success. Ten-year harvest trend, you know, again, you can see in the last 2 years with this drop, that was primarily the factor that of the severe winter conditions that we experienced in western Wyoming. That was likely the result of that. We had changed license structure to accommodate that, and so there was less hunters in the field, and therefore less resident hunter opportunity as well because of the loss of deer in western Wyoming. So starting off again with this chart, a little busy, but it's the regional quotas for these non-resident areas, and the hunt area quota, or the quota, is over on the far side to the right, and then the area designation is over on the left here. And so you can see Region A, of course, that corresponds to the upper northeast part of the state, and you can kind of find that through your book where the different regions are. But we've had a couple areas that had some changes this year. So the first one being Region B, which is immediately south of Newcastle and down towards Lusk and Casper and Glen Rock. And in that area, managers have been documenting more deer. There's more concern with the deer numbers on some of their habitats, but managers have bumped that up to 250. So it goes. The quota now is 1,350. And again, that was a balance between what it's primarily a private land area, and it was a balance between sportsmen's interest in hunting and the landowner acceptance of hunter densities on a lot of their private properties. So 250 is the increase that's proposed there. Region C is kind of the same thing, just west of the Black Hills, and the Sheridan region had proposed increasing that by 100. And again, it's a balance on landowner tolerance and hunter interest in participating in hunts there. We get to Region E, you know, in the Cody region, there's Region E, it's the 88, 92, 94, hunter is 96 through 98, and then 128, 148, 160, and 171, so that's kind of in the central part of the state here. Got that right? And there, they proposed decreasing that non-resident quota by 100, and that's primarily because of the high harvest relative to the number of bucks in the population and a declining buck ratio within that herd unit. Region R, managers also had some concerns with deer numbers and success and satisfaction, and they're proposing to reduce that quota by 150. And then we get down to Region W, down in the southwest part of the state, and managers there, that's at areas 82, 100, and 131, and managers there proposed to increase that quota back up to 900, where it had been previously. So looking at some of the common themes. If I can get to it. So in Jackson, there's general support for seasons, particularly for mule deer. There's outfitter concerns over shorter deer seasons in 2000. That was initially proposed in 2018 compared to 2017. Sheridan, there's lower numbers of mule deer in the Bighorn Mountains, and there's concerns about buck quality. And there's also concerns with running late seasons on mule deer because of the populations that are there. Green River had some concerns about doe fawn deer harvest in areas 82, and there's concerns about some of the habitats, and so the region has some seasons set there, but there's also some publics that have been concerned about the overall doe harvest that is there. There's also season length concerns in western Wyoming for that areas 132, 135, and 168. The continued opposition to limited quota season structure in southern Wyoming, the southern Wyoming range. So this, with the die-off that occurred last year, there was a lot of publics interested in restricting resident hunters, but we heard through a public survey last year that we did during the summer, as well as some of our public meetings, that our hunters like to have opportunity, and they like to just get out in the field, and so limited quota would be a step that would restrict them further, and most of our publics, resident hunters, are concerned about having that lost opportunity and so they heard a little bit about that in the Green River region this year. And hunters in the Green River region are split on the need for antler point restrictions. I think they like to see more, again, more opportunity to have a choice when they're out in the field and not have to worry about that restriction. And hunters and sportsmen in the Green River region are also split on increasing deer license quotas, and the Rock Springs mule deer herds 100, 101, and 102. So that's down in this kind of by Flaming Gorge. Lander region, there's several positive comments regarding increased license quotas proposed for deer. They're starting to see more deer, and so public is really supportive of that. Casper, there's some concern for extending general license deer in area 65, and on your map 65 is that area kind of south of Douglas and south of Glen Rock, and there's concerns there with some of the deer numbers on private lands, and so the seasons are were formulated to address some of the private land issues there. And finally, in the Pinedale region, there was concerns from some outfitters regarding the shorter deer season. And in your packet, I'll talk about that in the errata sheet. When we get to that, you'll see what we changed there to address the Jackson and Pinedale comments. Some of the emerging ongoing issues, there's continued interest in recovery of western Wyoming's deer. There's localized perceived hunter crowding issues during deer seasons yet. Sheridan, the North Bighorn mule deer buck quality and deer numbers there continues to be a concern with our publics. Green River, there's continued discussion about limited quota seasons and the southern Wyoming range, areas 134 and 135. And there's some renewed interest in doe harvest, especially for our archery hunters in the Green River region. Casper, the herds are above objective, at or above objective, and there's potential for future doe fawn harvest. And of course, whenever you talk about harvesting reproducing animals, there is some concern amongst our publics regarding that and potential population recruitment. And if once the region proposes that, we'll likely hear a little bit of opposition regarding that. But those populations, once they reach objective, the managers would like to institute some level of take on that segment of the population to kind of curb damage and reduce pressure on the habitats. Pinedale, there's continued interest in recovery of the Sublette Wyoming range, similar to Jackson, and they also have perceived hunter crowding issues. And then finally, the Lander region, Sweetwater mule deer buck harvest and ratios is a concern because of the quality of the deer in that portion of the state. So what I'd like to do is, because white-tailed deer is, a lot of the issues are very similar to mule deer, I would like to move right into Chapter 6, white-tailed deer. It's the same commission regulation chapter, and a lot of the public issues and management issues, merging issues are the same. And so with that, and then I'll talk about how we addressed public comment. So here's the limited quota license totals for the state. Again, Jackson, they had an increase of 15 for the type 3s, that's white-tailed deer licenses. You get to Cody, they had 225 increase. Sheridan, an increase of 25. Green River, an increase of 25. Laramie, an increase of 400. Lander, an increase of 250. And then Casper, a decrease of 2,930. And keep in mind, again, this is that change that was made to Chapter 6 to allow either species of antlerless deer be taken on that license type. So it's no net change, but because it went from one species and added another, it looks like it's a decline.
That's on private land.
It's private land, yeah. Okay, so the statewide net total then, of course, with that change in the Casper region, ends up being 1,990. And the whitetail harvest last year was 17,000, almost 18,000 deer with 63% hunter success. 10-year whitetail deer harvest trend increasing, and managers correspondingly are increasing our efforts to kind of maintain pressure on that species of deer, to kind of keep pressure on them and regulate that population growth. So some common themes related to white-tailed deer. There's a desire for more special seasons like archery, muzzleloader, youth seasons, both written and verbal comments received regarding that. And then subsequent changes, we didn't make any changes because we're liberalizing those seasons pretty much across the board. And the concerns statewide are is that white-tailed deer continue to expand, and we have concerns about that expansion and its impacts on mule deer. So some of the changes for the Chapter 6 related to deer in Jackson. So, and again, if you look at this errata sheet, so the errata sheet should have there, the Chapter 6 errata sheet has the yellow highlights are basically what was changed subsequent to the public meetings and what the regions decided to modify because of public comment. And so I'll just highlight those. I won't read through them on the errata sheet, but Jackson deer season closures on October 6th. That's a Saturday. So originally we were going to close, the regions wanted to close on a Friday to avoid additional take of animals on high level of harvest on a weekend. But following those public meetings and concerns raised at the public meetings and feedback we got from the public, we moved that to the 6th. In Cody, they moved the deer season in Hunter Area 37. They made the type 337 also valid in area 39. And they also had the Hunter Area 127 type 3 also valid in 125 again because of some private land issues and availability of harvest there. They've also proposed some changes to area 122 type 3 and 125 type 6. In the Sheridan region, they removed limitations on deer, Hunter Area 29 type 8, the September Dauphin season to allow private land harvest area wide. So before it was on a real limited amount of area, and this now they kind of liberalize that more. In Pinedale, again, it was mimicked the Jackson and Pinedale regions really had the same type of public comments, and so the deer seasons around the Pinedale area moved to October 6th, and that's a Saturday rather than the Friday. So. And with that, the department recommends that the commission move forward and adopt the Chapter 6 as recommended. And with that, I'll stand for questions too.
Any questions? Doug? Okay, I've got one blue sheet here from Rusty Kaiser. Good morning.
Morning.
Nice. How are you?
Thanks for having me here, President and Director Talbot and Commissioners. A little bit different meeting than last year with only one blue sheet, but I'll go ahead and take a little bit of your time. My name's Rusty Kaiser. I grew up in Kemmer, Wyoming, and now live in Pinedale. Spent my whole life poking around the Wyoming range and sublet mule deer herds. Just a quick clarification before I continue. I want to make it clear that I'm not here in a professional capacity today. My boss wants me to say that. I'm here as Rusty the Sportsman today. I'm not representing any agency. I was a little frustrated to see last year how this meeting went with a small group of individuals, mostly with some financial interest in the deer herd. When I say deer herd today, I'm talking about the western herds, Wyoming range and sublet. Come and complain and paint a pretty dismal picture of deer hunting in the western part of the state. And I think there was some false information given that I'd like to kind of clarify today. I have a little different opinion, and like a wise man once said, we're all entitled to our own opinion, but we're not entitled to our own facts. The Game and Fish does a great job of providing us with data, gathering data. They have incredible field personnel that provide us with data and facts so we can form opinions based on those facts. And what is some of that data? Doug shared some of it, but there's a lot of other data out there. I won't go into all of it. I've written all of you guys with some of that. we are not in a mule deer crisis, as some folks have indicated on social media and in these meetings. Our population data, if you look at a 40-year average, we're not doing too shabby, especially after a harsh winter like last year. The department counted, not modeled, but counted close to 30,000 deer this year. And if you look at years just preceding this winter, we were above the 40-year average, and pushing the population objective of 40,000. I think in 2015 and 16, they were in that 37, 38,000. So I don't see any reason for crisis or call for much change. With that many deer, we also have extremely high buck-to-doe ratios, oftentimes pushing the 40 mark, and almost always above the 30 to 100 range. This year, I think in the sublet it was around 33, and maybe in that 29 in the Wyoming range. We don't just have a lot of bucks, we have a lot of quality bucks. Thank you. Is that better? We don't just have a lot of bucks. I don't know. You can hear me?
Yep.
Maybe they can. Okay. We have a lot of quality bucks. There was a lot of talk last year about we weren't going to see the effects of this bad winter for a couple of years after the winter. And I just don't think that's true. The very people who said that, when you look at their websites, some of the outfitters, after the 2010-2011 winter, which was a pretty heavy mortality, hunting just got better and better. And they said that themselves, with this is the best year to date. This is one for the trophy books. And they told how many 200 inchers they were shooting. The Game and Fish data mirrors that. I'm not sure the exact year, but it was shortly after that winter when 11% of the deer that came through the Grays River check station were 30 inches or bigger. That's pretty phenomenal. You don't see that in many other states. So with this data, it shows me that the current hunt structure and seasons that are in place are working just fine. Giving residents a general opportunity to hunt each year is the best way to overcome the perceived crowding. Rather than put people in a small area in a small period of time, give them the general tag and let them spread out. Let them cover a broad area, and their chances of rubbing shoulders are going to go down. There's no need for limited entry, limited quota type hunts. There's no need for resident regions. There's no need to pick your weapon or have antler point restrictions. There's no need to try to conjure up a common opener or common closer like last year. These are usually just agenda-driven, ill-informed opinions with no biological support and very little social support. And I'll provide some data to back that up. The latest hunter attitude surveys that I could find going to 2016 in the Grays River showed 76% hunter satisfaction on their mule deer experience. When you have almost 8 out of 10 people happy with their hunt, I don't think there's much need to change that. And that other small percentage that are always wanting something different or wanting something better, maybe just don't understand what really drives this herd. And it's not hunters. It's been proven over decades and decades of data that what drives this herd are winter and habitat conditions. And we see the trends over when we have a heavy winter. Things get a little dicey for a year or two, and then we're right back. And it's been doing that for decades. And we recover really well. Now, I'm not saying we need to ignore issues for mule deer. We should continue on. The department does a great job. There's unprecedented habitat treatments going on. There's groundbreaking research occurring right now where we're identifying new migration routes and learning more about the herd. Highway structures, I could go on and on. The Mule Deer Initiative was a great way to see what the public really wanted for their herd, and the department's working on those things, none of which dealt with taking away resident opportunity and taking away their general tags. That wasn't part of the Mule Deer Initiative. So with all these things in place, I would just encourage the commissioners and the department to continue doing the great work you do, providing a world-class opportunity to hunt a world-class herd. And that goes right along with the department's motto of serving people. Thank you.
Any questions of Rusty? Thank you for coming over, thank you. And we started, Doug, over in that herd, we started a antler point restriction last year,
Mr. President,
and we got this year, right? And what is I'm digressing here, but I had somebody call me about a management hunt, or can we do, they're saying, well, you should go out and shoot this is in a different area than this. South of Rock Springs, they're saying, go out and shoot those 3-point, those 3x4s, and is that, do we have, they always say, oh, this state does that, and this state does that, and
Mr. President, members of the commission, I'm not aware of anything that, the proposals that we had from Chapter 6 last year. Some folks were opposed to those antler point restrictions, and they often draw conclusions about what the neighboring states are doing, and they, to lack of a better term, I think they think the grass is greener. And we felt that this, based on the feedback that the agency received last year, this was the best way to move forward with the addressing public concerns, realizing that antler point restrictions were, it's kind of just again, from us from a management standpoint. But I'm not aware of any other management activities or management proposals that were used to address that population change.
anybody else like to address Chapter 6? All right. Any questions from the? I hear a motion to approve Chapter 6 as presented. So moved. Galen, move. Second. Mr. Schmidt, second. Discussion? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? It passes. Thank you.
All right, Mr. President, Director Talbot, members of the commission, moving on to Chapter 7, the elk. All right, starting off again with that first slide that shows, again, the quota changes across the state. And keep in mind that we have some pretty major general license areas in the state, and so they're not reflective in this initial slide. And so those general license areas up around Cody, Jackson, down towards Big Piney, some of the Green River region, Sierra Madres, and we also have Area 9 also as general. So the changes in quotas, again, I'm just going to cover by region, the overall net total change. So Jackson region had an increase of 190 licenses this year, primarily in that type 6 area. The Cody region had a net gain of 0 because they decreased some full price licenses and increased those reduced price cow-calf licenses. Also the Sheridan region, increase of 500, primarily again in those type 6 licenses. Green River, increase of 360. Laramie, increase of 50. Lander, decrease of 140. Casper, increase of 175. And then Pinedale, a decrease of 100. And then we'll talk about the issues across within Chapter 7 as well. If I can get this thing to work. Okay, so statewide, and again, you can see the table up above here shows you by type what those changes were, and then for a net total of increase of 1,000 licenses. And again, that primarily was because of the increases in the type 5, 6s, and 7s. Last year's harvest, 24,000, almost 24,500 elk with 43% success. 43% success on elk is pretty phenomenal, really. You can go hunt a lot of other states, and when you can get that kind of success, and we've got some of these areas that we're running, 40 to 70% success on some areas. It's pretty amazing. Hunting for elk is pretty darn good in Wyoming. Same thing. Okay. 10-year harvest trend, a little bit off last year, but again, we had a pretty unusual fall. You know, we had some weather events, but then it kind of moderated, and then it was a pretty mild late in the season, and we saw that reflective in the hunters, you know, in the harvest level that was out there. But again, pretty phenomenal level of elk harvest across the state and good success. Hunters are pretty satisfied with elk seasons. Some of the common themes, concerns over in Jackson, concerns over the current status of the Grovant elk, and I think you remember from the last commission meeting I gave a briefing on the Grovant situation, and so that's reflective in these the public meetings that we have. And there was there's some suggestions from the publics on how to address some of that, and that involved the Park Service, National Park Service Elk Reduction Program in Elk Area 75, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we've got the National Park Service, Matt Wilbur is here to kind of present the Park Service's portion of the season, and then I can help clarify anything there. In the Cody region, sportsmen were split on concerning the special archery seasons in hunt areas 41 and 45, and I think if you folks have some questions on that, I can add clarification, but ultimately it was interest in separating the Type 9 license opportunity during the archery season from the traditional Type 1s, 4s, and 5s. And so historically, if you drew a Type 1, 4, or 5, you had an opportunity to also hunt during the archery season. And with the proposal the region was looking at, we were thinking of limiting that opportunity to just rifle hunt at a Type 1, 4, or 5. And so the public basically voiced some concerns regarding that, and we did change that back, and you'll see that in the errata sheet. So I'll touch on that again in a moment. In Sheridan, licenses were increased, and the public wanted some increases in the 38 Type 9s. Green River, there were concerns about elk objectives in West Green River and the Sierra Madre herd units. So down in this country down here, the public loves to hunt elk, and they love to have high quality elk hunting, but we're limited with what's acceptable on the landscape from a habitat standpoint, and with our some of our landowners in that area that provide, you know, some important crucial habitats for those animals. There's a saturation point for those folks, and so the region's trying to balance that now with the management, but definitely hunters like to see more elk. In the Laramie region, there's still some concern with the Area 10 Type 6 cow-calf licenses.
Can we go back?
Yep.
Mr. Bremeyer? That Fossil Butte, there was an article written about a year ago where Secretary Zinke was going to maybe allow hunting on some of these monuments, but the issue over there is that they count those elk as part of the, what do you call it, the population, but you can't hunt them because they go up there on that monument. And I didn't know if there's been anything happen with, I know the speed of government is, I thought that was a great proposal, but I haven't heard anything else. Do you know anything, Director Talbot?
And Mr. President, members of the commission, yeah, we're currently working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to open up several of the refuges to increased opportunity for hunting and fishing. We have not made any progress on the monument aspect of that. We're currently working on refuges right now rather than monuments. We'll see how it works.
Thank you.
I can get this thing to back up. All right, so changes subsequent to the public comment. So if we look at the Jackson region, we reduced, so in an effort concerning the Grovant elk, we reduced the hunt area 82 Type 4 licenses to address antlerless harvest. We also closed the state section of land in hunt area 75, which, if you're familiar with that country, once you drive through the town of Kelly, you go past the Warm Springs and up the Grovant. There's a state section right on the forest boundary, and last year, and Mr. Taylor, who's here today, mentioned it at the last commission meeting, those elk came out of the Grovant drainage and they were vulnerable to harvest, where historically they never really came out of that drainage. But we're starting to see this trend that those animals come out. And so the managers in the Jackson region, the wardens and biologists, and they considered the public comment, and they decided to work with the Park Service and get that within that hunt area to close that state section to hunting late in November, when those elk typically come in.
And we have signs there? I mean, you have people that have been used to hunting that state section. Are we gonna have, how do we let the public know that they?
Yes, Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot, the region will make some effort, and historically, the warden would go up the Grovant and put something right at the forest boundary, so public was well aware that they needed to stop there. And so that signage effort will be just moved down the drainage a mile to where it's a really defined boundary. When you're driving up the road, they can mark it pretty well, and I think we can handle that and make sure it's the education effort will be stepped up a little bit for that.
Thank you.
Cody region, again, because of the concern regarding the special hunting archery opportunity for those limited quota licenses, we reinstated that. And again, you'll see on that errata sheet that we handed out for Chapter 7, it shows the changes that we made for 41 and 45 for the special archery, which will be on the back of that sheet. And so and we can touch on that again if you have questions. Casper region, for elk hunt area 126, the season dates for the type 6 licenses were extended to December 31st, and the quota was increased slightly. Pinedale reduced the number of type 4 and type 6 licenses in area 95, which is the upper green. And that is to address changes in population recruitment that are anticipated there. Lander region, increasing the quota, the number of type 1 licenses by 25 in hunt area 24, so in this area down in here. Some emerging and ongoing issues within the elk herds across the state include the status of the Grovant elk. There's really a lot of concern regarding that population, the distribution and their seasonal movements. Management of non-migratory elk from Spring Gulch, which, if you remember from last year, is at hunt area 78. That provides kind of a haven for elk, and it's extremely reproductive-wise, it's extremely, the elk do really well there. So they have lots of calves, and it's something that we've got to keep our tabs on and control. In the Cody region, the thoroughfare elk seasons, a number of years ago, the Cody Working Group met, and that hunting season in area 60 was changed to September 20th. So there's always some interest from our publics regarding that opportunity in the backcountry there. Sheridan, they're continuing to explore options to increase harvest on private lands. As we mentioned at some of our previous meetings on license allocation, we've got a growing elk population across the eastern part of the state, and if you look at the growth curve of elk numbers in the eastern part of the state compared to the west, we're trying to stabilize numbers in the west to sustain the hunting opportunity that we have there, but in the east, the populations continue to grow, and so that's reflective in that ongoing issue for the folks in the eastern part of Wyoming. Green River, there's high public interest in the West Green River and Sierra Madre herd objectives, as I touched on earlier. Sportsmen want more elk. Landowners are basically, they're at their tolerance level with the numbers of elk that they can tolerate on a lot of their lands that they own. And also in hunt area 100, if you remember last year, the region proposed 25 type 2 licenses for spike-only elk. There was a lot of interest in those, and with that license, you could archery hunt for any elk, and so everybody that drew one of those went out and shot tried to archery hunt for a larger bull. And so this year, the managers are clarifying the limitations section of the regulation. So if you have a type 2 license, you are required to harvest a spike elk, whether it's during the special archery season or the rifle.
Where was that? Was that in this chapter 2 or the section we did earlier?
No, that, Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot, that Chapter 2 is just the definition of a spike elk. This change will be in the special section on the back. You'll see it in the Chapter 7 for the special archery seasons. There's quite a bit of material there, I understand, but it's basically at the end of the limitations and, yeah. So area 100 type, it should say.
Unless otherwise specified, archers with a hunt area 100 type 2 license shall take spike elk only.
Correct.
Thank you.
And so with that, I would like to introduce Matt Wilbur with Grand Teton National Park, and then he'll talk a little bit about the Area 75 and 79 park season proposals, and then I'll be available to clarify any questions as well.
Welcome. Welcome, Ms. Wilbur. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot. I appreciate your time. Again, my name is Matt Wilbur. I'm Supervisor, Grand Teton National Park, here to present our recommendation, joint recommendation for the 2018 elk reduction program within Grand Teton. Okay, so with the bison elk management plan, objectives that are in place from that plan is that Jackson Hole herd, we're looking at 11,000 animals. With the biologists from Game and Fish as well as the Park Service, we're just under that, 10,800, give or take a few animals. So we're at objective, and the biologists are considering the herd stable. The National Elk Refuge, which is just to the south of us, hoping for 5,000 or less head on property during the winter. This past winter, they did not have to feed at all, so no feed went down. The bull-cow ratios within the park are looking for 35 bulls per 100 cows, and counted 28 to 100. So we are under objective at the moment, and as you see there, that 5-year running average is typically right around 30. And then our Grand Teton herd, 1,600 animals is what we're attempting for. Seeing another slide, we're sitting at about 1,200 animals at the moment through counts via aviation. Okay, so here's that elk count that we had within park, Jackson herd, so 1192 what was counted, and that was 28 bulls. Again, that was all done by fixed wing and rotor wing work with the biologists. So all the blue lines there covering the park, all the little red dots are basically the grouping of animals at the moment. So, boy, touchy. Based off that information, both Game and Fish and the Park Service are recommending that we do hold a 2018 elk reduction program. Last year's seasons for Hunt Area 75 were October 28 through December 10. This year we're basically recommending the exact same, just moving the dates around a little bit. So October 27 to December 9 would be Area 75. The Antelope's Flat section, which is right in there, tends to close early. We're recommending that to close early again this year. That would be a November 25th closure. And then, as Doug stated earlier, that state piece is right in there. That would also close November 25th. And it's not marked on this map. It will get marked on that map. And to follow up on how hunters will be educated, if someone is successful in drawing a tag for Area 75 or 79, the park sends out a packet with our permit and other information. A map very similar to that will be sent out to them. So that'll be another aspect of education. Area 79, very short season. We're recommending October 27 to October 31, so 4 days. And there's also going to be a decrease in size in that area. We only had 2 animals taken from that area last year. It's not been productive in the past. All the major calving and the populations are down on that southern end of Area 75. So all that blue striping will be closed this year for hunting. That red Area 79 is what would be available for 79. And we're also proposing 575 permits. That's down 25 from last year, just based off of population numbers, and then also that closure of that upper portion of Area 79. Well, that last slide is basically going into what we've had in place since 2013, some of those rules and regs that we've had in place for use of copper rounds being a requirement. That's still in play. The Snake River bottoms, which is basically south of the Deadman's Bar area down to Ditch Creek, and west of Highway 89 were remaining closed because of that bear-human interaction, hunter interaction. We've had some good success there. The limit of 7 rounds per day on person, and then also 1 shot fired into a running group of animals. Those are some specifics that we have in-house. So with that, any other questions, comments, or concerns I may be able to address?
Yes, sir.
A question for Matt. Matt, what did you say your objective on the feed ground was? 5,800?
5,000 or less.
5,000 or less. And I understand you didn't feed this winter, but how many elk showed up on the feed ground, and how did it relate back to your objective?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't know that we've got a true and accurate count on the refuge unless you have that, Doug.
Mr. President, members of the commission, and Commissioner Culver. So the overall, we did not feed on the National Elk Refuge, but when we went and the region conducted their count, they did some ground counts, and then they went and flew at the same time, and there was about 7,200 elk on the refuge property, or the kind of the valley floor portion of the Jackson Elk Herd. Those aren't, that's not exactly what would be on feed because the feeding area is a little bit smaller than what we ended up ground counting, but it pretty much covered all the elk that were on the valley floor there.
Thank you.
And I also should add as well that last year we had 600 permits within Area 75, 79, and we had 242 animals taken, so we were also sitting at that 40% success rate. Okay. Thank you for your time.
How many are in the river bottom? Do they figure? Below, it'd be below you though, I guess, where you guys go to the airport, I guess, is about where your park ends, or?
Well, so yes, that would be Area 78. So for us, 75 goes to basically the Grovant River, is that boundary between Elk Refuge and National Park Service, as well as that Area 78.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
So that concludes, Mr. President, members of the commission, and Director Talbot, that concludes the portion of the Chapter 7 presentation. And at this point, the department recommends that the regulation be adopted as proposed.
Okay. We've got one blue sheet of Chapter 7. Chance Marshall.
Mr. President, Director Talbot, and Commissioners, thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Chance Marshall, and I'm here today representing myself. My family runs an outfitting business here in Wyoming, and many of our hunts take place within the areas encompassing the Red Desert region. If I could, I'd like to draw your attention back to the Area 100 Type 2 license again. Last year, 2017, was the first year that these 25 licenses were offered. And I understand that it was uniquely created to manage spike bulls. However, there were no changes made to the archery seasons, which state that archers with limited quota type 1, 2, 3, or 0 elk licenses may take any elk during the hunt area, or in the hunt area or areas for which the license is valid. This meant that branch antlered bulls could be harvested with this license during the 2017 archery season. The Type 2 license was created after the non-residents were, applications were due. So in 2018, this was the first year that licenses were available to non-residents. This year, 2018, we had a non-resident client from Australia who applied and drew this license. She paid the special license fee and used her accumulated preference points to draw this tag in hopes to have a chance to hunt any elk during the archery season in one of Wyoming's premium areas. Prior to applying, there were no indications that these archery regulations would change. However, after her license was awarded, the proposed regulations will keep her from doing so and limit her to spike bull during all seasons. I understand the need to manage elk populations effectively. However, I do not think that this change in regulation was done fairly on behalf of non-residents who are coming to our state to hunt. I believe that if these changes were made, there should have been indications up front prior to applications being due. This has kind of been referred to as a loophole, but I don't understand why the loophole was created in the first place, and was it just designed to benefit resident hunters, or was it an oversight? To my understanding, there was discussion that occurred when this license was created, but to my understanding, it was decided that the changes would not be made. So that's kind of my question is, was this change fairly done, since it was after the non-resident applications were already due and awarded? Thank you.
Doug, could you,
Sorry.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot. So last year when that 25 licenses was proposed, it was an oversight that once it was created, and then once they realized that it was only 25 licenses, it wasn't that big of a deal to allow the special archery hunting opportunity for that license type. The region had some concerns from a management standpoint that there was recruitment of spike bulls was pretty high, and they really wanted to target specific that age class of animal. And so with the change this year, there was 4 non-residents that put in for those 25 initial in the draw, and so there was 4 non-residents that would have drew that. And yes, they would have not have, some of them did not know that change was being considered by the region. It's our proposal that if somebody has that license type, they can come back to the license review board, because it's limited to the number that there's only 4 of them there. If the region can maintain that limitation on that archery season, they were proposing to increase that to 50. If you look in the regulation, it says 50 Type 2s this year. If it's the Commission's pleasure to go back and allow that those 25, or allow that license type to hunt any elk during the archery season, it's our preference that that quota be dropped back to 25. Just so that we don't have 50 people with a Type 2 license that go try and archery hunt a big bull. When it's primarily management-wise, it's more desirable to have spike bull taken on that license.
Mr. President?
yes, Mr. Doobie.
I'd be hypocritical if I didn't say something about this. We had the similar situation in other areas, and I believe we should handle it the same way. So that needs to, if the non-residents were not aware and had no knowledge of that change until after the application process, they should not be subject to that. So however you want to handle that, you're proposing if we do that, we go back to 25, correct?
Yes, the region would propose that we either let the non-resident go to the license review board for their issue that they have, or we'd go back to 25 licenses.
Yeah, if I follow up. Yeah, that would be my proposal, that that person be allowed to hunt the way that they applied for. You know, part of the problem is we have all these areas with preference points, and people garner points. I don't know how many it takes to get to that area. I mean, I don't know, but either way,
we have to be aware of what they've had to go through to get those points and use them, and we can't just willy-nilly take them away.
Thank you.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir, Mr. Crank.
so would you explain the license review board? Because we had this same issue last year in
78.
78, and I think the way we handled it was we let those folks come to the license review board and put them back in the position they would have been if they hadn't applied and gotten that license. So they were given back their preference points. I mean, it costs them a year of hunting, I guess, is the downside to that hunter, but we handled it through the license review board rather than adjusting their quotas, so.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot, and Commissioner Crank, that's correct. And that would be a recommendation to the Commission that they do go through the License Review Board. That's Division Chief Nesbitt, Fiscal Division Chief, and myself.
You know, Mr. President, I think the problem is created by the timing of our non-resident elk draw, and we have a few of these glitches every year, but I guess personally, I think we should keep an eye on our management objectives, and if we need to kill 50 spiked elk out of the red desert, we ought to kill 50 spike elk out of the red desert. And it's unfortunate that our timing causes these problems, but we ought to restore that person to their preference points and allow them to, you know, make an informed, I guess, after the fact informed choice about whether they want to hunt a spike elk in the red desert or if they want to maintain their preference points and apply for future years and have the opportunity to hunt a trophy class bull. But
Mr. President,
Yes, Ms. Galen.
is there a chance that we could let them hunt this year, have that regulation apply to the season in 19? The non-residents that drew it were under the assumption they could hunt. What if we let them hunt that way this year, but then go spikes only next year? Then it's in the regulations, everybody knows.
Mr. President, Director Talbot, and Commissioner Galen, Bird, that we would be fine with moving that way, but we would prefer that we reduce that 50 allocation back to 25 so that we don't have 50 people going out and hunting. Is that what you're asking?
I think, yes. Thank you.
Mr. President, will we have the same problem next year?
Mr. President and members of the Commission and Commissioner Crank, we would propose and then have the hunt planner, you know, it would be notified on there ahead of time because we know that we're going that direction.
The packet.
We could do a little better job informing within the packet when we know that change. The real problem arises in December when we develop these regulations for the non-residents to start looking online. And so by January when they're applying, sometimes the managers don't have all the details worked out within their own regions and with all the constituents, what they want that to look like. And a lot of times that occurs through the period of March. This particular hunt area we should have known ahead of time, and the region did reach out to some of the non-residents that drew during that time frame to let them know that they were looking and considering that change, that we were going to present that here. So of the 4 non-residents, they talked to some of them anyway that I don't know if Todd's here, he can tell me how many that they've actually talked to, but out of the 4. Because in the initial draw, the region recommended 25 total licenses for the non-resident draw, and that was in January when we have to make that recommendation. So, and then since public comment, they wanted to bump that to 50 if they could keep it as a spikes only license type.
So you're saying 16% times the 25 is the 4 licenses that were.
Yep, that were issued during the initial non-resident draw.
So, Mr. President, I'd be prepared to make a motion that the commission adopt the Chapter 7 as presented with the understanding that the department would reach out to those 4 non-residents, inform them of the License Review Board and their options.
The motion?
But the question, if they go to the License Review Board, that does not give them the option to hunt as they planned this year?
Commissioner, Mr. President, members of the Commission, Commissioner Schmidt, it does not allow them to go this year. It reinstates their status prior to the application period.
Here, a second to that motion?
I'd second.
Motion by,
Mr. President?
yes, sir.
I speak against that motion. I think it's wrong of us to allow an application situation where people apply under one auspices and then partway through we change it. I think that's
I agree
wrong.
with you, Pete.
And I think that you know, we get a little cavalier with these preference points, and people have spent a lot of time and effort and money in acquiring them and planning on a hunt, and then partway through the application process, we change the rules. I just think that's wrong. I think if they knew up front, so be it. But this proposal, this motion, basically all it does is just give them their money back and give them their points back.
Right.
But I don't agree with that. I think that's fine maybe from some other circumstances, but in this particular circumstance, we put out there January 1, we say this is what it's going to be, and then partway through January, we change the rules. That's not right.
But I would agree with you, Pete. I mean, we're better than that. These people need to hunt as they plan this year. If we want to make the adjustment, it needs to be made in 2019.
But we have to understand also that this is how we do business. We have to have those non-resident draws earlier in the year, and we don't want to finalize these seasons until after we've come through the winter and see what our herds have done through the winter. So it's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate reality of the way we do business and the way we have to do business that this type of situation can arise. And in this particular circumstance, we are doing everything we can to make sure that those parties are as uninjured as possible. But I don't think we can change what our biologists and our field people recommend every time there's going to be an injured party because of the way this works.
Mr. President, is there a third option out there? I'd throw this out. Could we allow these 4 non-residents to hunt branch antlered bulls because that's how they applied and that's what they believed they were getting? And then have 46 resident tags that are for spikes only? I mean, does that, I'd throw that out. I don't know how much grief that causes you, Doug, or if we've ever done such a beast before, but.
Mr. President, members of the commission, I guess I was waiting to see if there was some other direction from the director's office on this, but
just as an aside, I was party to these, you know, when he proposed the spike elk season last year, he went through a lot of static. I mean, but he got it done. Mark Zorn's over there. And then they see that there was a loophole. Now, I'd never read that, so that shows you how I look for these loopholes. I saw the thing says spike elk, so you put in, you want to go shoot a young, nice spike elk. But what Commissioner Doobie's saying, I guess if that's what you read it and that's what you assumed when you put in, I guess that's a cause for concern.
Mr. President, one other comment. I mean, the solution to this is to move our non-resident elk drawing date back to.
I think we're going to discuss that when we're going to talk about the allocation study from 16 to 20% on elk. I think that'll be brought up in these public meetings around the state.
Sure, but I mean that's the solution to this problem is that the regulations don't go out till the commission's actually voted on them, and it's set in stone. You know, that we're going to have
Mr. President,
20 non-resident elk tags that are, you know, we're going to have 50 spike bull tags in the red desert. I mean, that's the ultimate solution, but I think the outfitters might scream about that as well. But
yes, sir, Mr. Bremeyer.
Mr. President, members of the commission, and Commissioner Crank, the department would be totally satisfied with maintaining the 25 quota for this year, reinstating the opportunity for them to hunt similar to last year's regulation. And then this year, when we move forward in December with the hunt planning and the packet, we will make that very clear in there that limitation will be reinstated. And that way we don't have folks upset with that type of season structure for this year. It's 25 bulls. It's not worth arguing over for too long. And they'll be there next year, and it'll be a much better opportunity for people to participate in that hunt.
Well, there's a motion on the floor to, I believe it's to leave it like it is. Is that that was a motion? I'm not.
Yes.
It's been moved and seconded. I wish Commissioner Rail was here. I don't know where.
So, Mr. President, the motion is to leave it like it is and then reach out to those 4 non-residents and give them the option of withdrawing their applications, restoring their points.
Okay.
And go ahead and then harvest the 50 spikes.
Is that the way you understand it, Mr. Crank? Yeah.
It's contrary to, just so we all understand, I mean, it's contrary to what Commissioner Doobie and Commissioner Schmidt are expressing, so. But that's Mr. Culver's motion and my second.
Any other discussion? Well, I think we have to take a vote. I'd like to do a roll call vote. You do that?
Sure.
All right. Commissioner Crank?
I'd vote aye.
Commissioner Doobie?
Nay.
Nay?
Nay.
Aye.
All right, that motion is defeated. Would you like to entertain another motion then to change the quota on this to, do we do a motion to change it down to 25? Because I think that's where we're headed, right? If we're going to leave this loophole in there, then we want to reduce it down to 25 spikes.
That's right.
Is that a motion or?
Any elk.
Huh? Or any, is it any elk? Is that what it's?
Is it any elk or just bull elk?
It's spikes. That's what it was supposed to be.
Spike
They want
elk.
to harvest some spikes.
But then when you look at the special archery regulation, it opens it up to any.
100 out in the desert.
So that was the loophole.
The desert?
Yeah.
So your proposal is to keep it the same as it was?
Keep the archery season, special archery season section, I maybe section 3 the same, but modify section 2 for area 100 type 2 to be 25 from 50, so that we have it the same as last year.
I'll make that motion.
I would second that.
Made by Mr. Doobie and seconded by Mr. Schmidt.
Mr. President?
Yes, sir, Mr.
I agree with most everything you're saying, Commissioner Culver. I just think it's more of a problem with our process, not their application. We have to figure out a way to make that right, however we do that. And I know there's people out there that are already working on that. But I agree with that. We have to go by what the science says, but we also cannot be letting our clients be hoodwinked, so to speak.
I think when they read the regulations, that needs to be the way it's gonna be.
Okay, so moved and seconded to on area 100 type 2 to 25 spike elk only. Any more discussion?
That's not the motion, Mr.
No?
President.
What is it?
Well, I guess it is, but
Yeah, but the
just so we all understand, in the operation of the archery regulation, it would be 25 any elk.
No, this reads spike elk only.
But we're going back to last year's.
It would revert to last year's language in section 3, so the red strike through in there that changes the hunt area 100, it's the addition.
We'll take that on there.
Take that out. Change 100 from 50 to 25, and then strike the language in section 3. So those folks who applied get exactly what they applied for.
Okay, so to restate that, we go to 25 spike.
Type
area
2.
Type 100 type 2 and strike the change of the section 3 special archery.
That's correct.
That's what everybody's,
Reverts back to what it was last year.
reverts to what it was last year. Any more discussion?
Which was any elk, right?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
All right, so we're going back to what we did last year. Tell Zorns to keep trying to kill those spikes, will you, Todd? Jeez. Oh, okay, and any more comment on is there anybody who'd like to speak about the chapter 7, the elk, before we approve the regulation or disprove it or whatever we're gonna do? Seeing none, I hear a motion to approve chapter 7.
So moved.
Galen Bird moved,
Second.
second by Mr. Rayo. Discussion? All in favor of approving chapter 7? Aye. Opposed? That passes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Director Talbot, members of the commission. We're now ready to move on to Chapter 8, moose seasons. And
Mr. President, would be a good time for a break.
I think it's a good time for a break. It's 11:25 with 10 minutes. 11:35 back to work. Mr. Bremeyer, Chapter 8.
Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot, thanks, and I'll proceed with Chapter 8. And so Moose. And so statewide, you know, I just want to preface this whole chapter with a little bit of a summary. Statewide, we're really concerned about moose numbers, and that kind of carries through with some of the localized issues that you've heard from our publics in the past, and some of the research that you sponsored to help kind of get at the root of some of our concerns. And we statewide, we manage primarily for bull harvest, and last year we're estimating that we have about 3,000 moose in the state, and with that we physically count 2,000 animals in the various herd units, from the bighorns through Cody region and down into the Sublet herd and Jackson herds, and then down to the Uintas and Evanston area. So that's 2,000 animals that are counted. We typically harvest all bulls, except in areas where there's real high reproduction and some potential for damage. We allow a little bit of cow harvest. And last year we harvested 267 animals, 267 bulls, with 27 of those were cows or calves, and so I think there's only like 3 or 4 calves. We do collect teeth. Last year we collected about 70% of the harvest, so we had real close to 200 tooth samples. We make a pretty significant effort to contact all the hunters that participate in this hunt. There's been discussion in the past about requiring mandatory harvest checks. And we thought about that for a while, and that would increase the burden of our regions pretty significantly when you consider the Pinedale region may be issuing, you know, close to the entire area there may be 100 licenses, and so that's a lot of extra burden on the regions when we already have a really high contact rate with those hunters. And so what we do in smaller hunt areas where there's less than 10 licenses, we typically reach out individually to those hunters and encourage their submission of those tooth samples. So we don't feel that we need to require or adopt any kind of regulation that requires mandatory checks at this point, because we continue to maintain a real high interaction with those hunters. Again, in the herd statewide, we manage extremely conservatively when you consider that we count over 2,000 animals in the population, and so we think that we can continue to provide hunting opportunity for our hunting publics. When you look at the breeding strategies for moose, bulls do a lot of traveling around, and they breed with less females than like elk or some other species do, but bulls widely travel, and so because of that behavior, we try to maintain a pretty high bull ratio across the state. And so when you look at some of the support materials there's going to be some information about bull ratios, and so generally we manage for about 50 plus bulls per 100 cows on moose, so that we can maintain an adequate pregnancy rate. And when we look at the Snowy Range or the Bighorns or Jackson and Sublet, one of the factors that we look at is the percentage of adults that are pregnant, to make sure that the number of bulls is adequate. And so hunting a small number of bulls across the population, we believe, is not a significant population regulating factor, because the bulls, again, do a lot of traveling, and they do, those cows are getting bred and conceiving calves. And so one of the things that our regions look at, and the university's got a study right now through Dr. Brett Jesmer is working on, I believe it's his doctorate now, with looking at some indices with the population. And one of those is that you could pick up a fecal sample from cows in a drainage and then determine pregnancy, and then you could also do dietary and some genetics work. But we have the ability to kind of continue monitoring to make sure that there's adequate pregnancy in these populations. And so in the future, that's probably something that we'll be looking at a little closer. And with that, I'd like to start off with, we'll look at the regulation. If I can get this thing to work again. I don't know if it matters where it's pointed. Yeah, it worked. Is there any way you guys can back that up one slide? I'll turn this on again, see if it'll. There we go. So in Jackson, remember that we talked about this last year, that the regions had the ability to issue less than 5 licenses as long as we still met the requirements of the allocation to non-residents. And so the Jackson region decreased 3 licenses within the region, and then that was balanced on the, with the work that was being looked at in Pinedale as well. And so Jackson region had a decrease of 3. Cody, there was no change. Sheridan had added 5 type 1 licenses. Green River, no change. Laramie, no change. Lander, no changes. Cassret's not applicable. And then Pinedale, they reduced by 7 licenses this year. And then statewide, that allocation came up to a decrease of 5 licenses. And so the total harvest, again, was 295, and it's a 94% success. So again, we maintain a pretty conservative approach to managing our moose populations because of the real high demand, and it takes full number of preference points to hunt in some of these areas. So the concerning part again, and this is that harvest trend that we've been noticing for quite some time, but it's the declining trend. But again, because of the breeding behavior and the number of animals, we're counting 2,000 plus animals, and we're estimating that we're about 3,000 animals in the state. Providing that hunting opportunity for our publics is not driving this population. There's other factors that are influencing reproduction and survival and recruitment of those reproducing animals. And so we're managing on a conservative trend, and we'll continue to look at this. And I think one of the objectives that we have is to maintain the age structure of the bulls, and so the tooth data is pretty important to us, and we need to maintain not only a fairly high number of bulls, but you got to have some older age class bulls to do some breeding in the population. And so I think we have one member of the public, Mary, will get up and talk a little bit about some of the age structure concerns that she has in Area 9. But again, we think from a population standpoint, we're still where we need to. We can still provide some opportunity. So some of the themes and concerns and issues. Jackson, there's concern over those moose numbers. Cody, same thing. There's concerns about moose numbers and that moose hunting in Area 9 along the Wood River. Based on the public feedback that we received during public meetings, we did not propose any subsequent changes. And from an emerging issue standpoint, we will continue to monitor those moose populations and evaluate that hunting opportunity. It was in the late 2000s that we were really concerned about some of the areas around Jackson, the areas south of Yellowstone Park, and we got to the point where the hunting statistics indicated that we should be really concerned with the number of bulls that were in that area, and so we did reduce and close those areas in the late 2000s. And our field managers continue to monitor for that type of changes, especially in the Grovant drainage where the recruitment's a little bit suppressed. And we're looking at that in areas kind of south of Jackson as well, that area 10 and 20, or 21, sorry. So again, I know that we'll have some public opinion on this in a few minutes regarding the presence of moose and the other drainages, and we can talk about that a little bit later as well. And with that, I would stand for any questions, and it's the department's recommendation that the commission adopt Chapter 8 as recommended, and I'm sure you have a couple blue sheets there.
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. Crane.
Tell me, we're proposing to kill 10 antlerless moose in areas 25 and 4.
Yes, Mr. President, Commissioner Crank. The areas 25 and 24 typically have works, for better lack of a better term, and we offer a little bit of an opportunity to kind of control those numbers when they come into ranchers' haystacks. And we've had some, issues in the last couple of years with animals in the urban setting that were, self-defense moose shootings, and so we feel that it's prudent to offer a little bit of antlerless opportunity in those areas to address that type of concern. They're localized.
Mr. Schmidt, that looks like that's in your neck of the woods.
It is.
What do you think about killing cow moose over in that neck of the woods?
I'm okay with it. There seems to be a good population of moose. I mean, not as good as it was in the past, of course, but it seems to be stable. I know we've cut cow tags over the last few years, I believe.
Yes.
From that area, but there is a lot of interaction on the local ranches there with moose problems. And we did have an incident last year of a self-defense case, so I'm okay with it.
Okay. And then we took the limitation on the Wood River drainage out of our regulations this year.
Yes, Mr. President, members of the Commission, Commissioner Crank, the region conducted some camera surveys in that area, and they came up with, a number of moose throughout the drainage, and they felt that it was unnecessarily restrictive. So the regulation, the language in that was limiting hunters in that drainage, and we felt that it was, from a population standpoint, that was unnecessary. And I know Mary is here today, that she disagrees with that, and I know she'll have some comments to share with us on that.
Well, we've got two blue sheets. Terry Pollard.
Morning.
Morning, sir.
Mr. President, Scott, Director, and members of the Commission. I'm Terry Pollard. I'm from Pinedale, Wyoming. I'm an outfitter there. Been an outfitter there for 40 years or so. And I did want to comment on the moose in that area. We had been in discussions with your personnel there around Pinedale for a couple of years on the possibility of combining areas 3 and 4. And I'm totally in favor of that. Suffolk County Outfitters were also in favor of that. They tend to be the same moose. We've seen it quite a bit last year, in that we had a tremendous amount of snow in the fall, starting clear in mid-September. And a lot of our moose seemed to move down into Area 4. So I was kind of, when the Game and Fish personnel came to us about cutting 5 licenses off of Area 3, I at first really wasn't too much in favor of it. Although even in our area, we did, where we were hunting, I think I had four moose hunters in Area 3 last year. We did have to hunt a few days extra to kill the bigger bulls, to find the bigger bulls. I think the reason was, I don't know that it's a population problem, I think it was a migration problem. I think what we've seen over the years, I've been hunting those moose for 40 years, and we see them going back and forth over that area, that Forest Service line, that Area 3 and 4 line all the time. And so we, talking with, like I say, the personnel there in Pinedale, we tend to agree that those are the same moose, and that we would like to see Area 3 and 4 combined. And this year they went ahead and the recommendation is to allow Area 3 hunters to hunt 4 and Area 4 hunters to hunt 3. And I'm all in favor of that. I would like to, this year try that, but I would like to keep the option that I'd like to see maybe in the future to see those two areas combined completely, to where we'd have the quota, 15 or 20 moose for Area 3, 4, and instead of only five licenses in Area 3 as proposed this year, and 10 in Area 4. I think the weather conditions and the moose movement and all of that type thing will determine where those moose are moving, whether they're in 3 or in 4. So yeah, I'd just like to support that recommendation from our personnel there. I'd like to also say that our personnel in the Pinedale district are extremely good. We work with them very close. They're as good as they come, I think. We really appreciate their efforts and their ability and willingness to talk with us and communicate with us. Having said that, I think our moose in area 3, 4, and 25 especially, and that's where I hunt, are in very good shape overall. Like I say, the bigger bulls in area 3, I think, seem to move into area 4 last fall, but I think overall the moose are in very, very good shape. I'm gonna kind of preference that a little bit and move, and I don't want to change the subject too much, but we're starting to see some wolves in those areas, and I hope you guys, when you're doing your wolf seasons later on, will consider that. I know you've made a new area, area 14, which is area 3 and 4, but there's only one wolf proposed for that area. So I'll be communicating with you more on that wolf issue, but you know, we've seen what they did to the moose in Jackson. We've seen what they're doing to the moose in Cody and different places. Let's get ahead of the game on the moose in area 3 and 4, and you know, really start managing these wolves a little more aggressive there. I think we got plenty of wolves. They're going to have pups this spring. I think we can take some more wolves rather, you know, just one in that area is just way too little. Antlerless cow moose. I tend to agree with what Mike says. I think the moose population does probably justify taking some cows. I'd like you to be very conservative on cows. That's where our population is, you know. So I'd like to maybe see a few cow permits taken out of there, especially area 25. But overall, like I say, from what I'm seeing, and we spend an awful lot of time with those moose in the season, we're seeing that our moose in 3, 4, and 25 are overall in very good shape.
Right. Any questions of Mr. Pollard? Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mary Rumsey.
President Anselmi, Director Talbot, members of the Commission. My name is Mary Rumsey, and I would like to thank the Cody team for all their efforts in Moose Hunter Area 9 to document and monitor our moose. While the data needs some refinement, it is a very positive step. I am here today on behalf of the numerous people who have commented to the Commission over the past 4 years about the declining moose populations on the Wood River. The Kerwin moose, the Wood River moose, took 60% of the harvest hit in 2014, while we only have approximately 20% of the documented population. Historically, we take a 40% hit. The young moose that are being killed on the Wood River are not helping Game and Fish make their harvest objectives. The hunt area is below its primary median age objectives, and the other objectives are moving down as well, except for hunter satisfaction, because moose hunting's easy in our area. The herd as well is right at their median age objective. We need balance in the hunt area so hunting can continue not only in the hunt area, but also for the overall herd. The road hunting that is going on in the Shoshone National Forest is muddling that balance for those who want to hunt moose and those who want to see moose. In 2017, again, moose were named to the SWAPS report as being a species in need of greatest need of conservation. Wood River is a prime breeding ground for moose. If we want to strengthen the herd and the hunt area, it makes no sense to continue to allow road hunting to go on and bring these numbers down. For the sake of balance, I would request the following hunt limitation in Hunt Area 9. Antlered moose, Wood River drainage on the National Forest shall be closed. Thank you for your consideration and support of all the precarious moose populations throughout the state. Are there any questions?
Mr. President?
Yes, sir.
Mary, you said objective numbers. Where are you getting those objective
From Bart
numbers?
Kroger, our biologist.
From who?
Bart Kroger, our biologist in Worland.
Okay, thank you.
So, and it's, I mean, if the age objectives continue to be, I said, wait a second, Bart, we're, you know, below our median age objectives. And he goes, well, we're making it on the herd unit, so we, it's business as usual. He didn't say business as usual, but it's kind of silly to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. And it's too easy. It's 12 miles of road right along the river. And to continue to let it go on and let a few hunters screw up the balance for everyone is silly. Seeing moose in Meeteetse is a big tourist attraction, and hunting moose continues to be important, but it's getting unbalanced.
Mary, I very much, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the commission, appreciate your passion. I flew that with the Game and Fish here a couple of months ago, and the moose population was fairly strong. Now, that was wintertime, so I don't know if that was our wintering range, but it was pretty strong, I thought. So
the aerial surveys showed roughly the same number of moose as they did in the prior year, and Bart is to be commended on all his efforts for doing the surveys. The camera studies they're doing, it's a little confusing because Bart makes a lot of effort to define the moose, the antlered moose he's seeing by antler construction, but the female moose and the calves, it's hard to individually identify them. A lot of the pictures are at night, they're in the dark, and then in the newsletter that was just put out, they said there was 80 moose, which there could be, but they were combining the aerial survey where they don't individually identify the moose with the camera survey. So
one thing I can say about the Game and Fish, when they say 80 moose, there's probably 100.
Well, I think there's some double counting, but it's tough to see. All I know, it does not negate the fact that the people in the area see a lot less moose than they used to, or they see no moose at all. People used to see lots of moose. I think you even mentioned you ended up and stayed at the Sperry cabin when you were working with our people, and you saw no moose. And it's really sad. I mean, people loved, Jim Olson, our game warden, I said, people love to drive to Kerwin. It's an old ghost town mining camp, and they love to, not really, but anyways, they love to go there and see a moose along the way, and it's great for tourism. And most people don't see that. Jim said, I like seeing a moose on the drive to Kerwin. And while there's still moose there, it's greatly declining, and killing these young moose is just messing things up for everyone.
So and I see one comment. So you would suggest no moose hunting on the national forest?
On the national forest.
And what's that going to do?
It will eliminate a lot of the road hunting on the 12-mile road that is directly above the Wood River.
So did you allow hunting on your place last year?
It's only 36. We would not have, and we couldn't have because it was restricted by you.
By you?
Well, I mean, actually, it was the language that was recommended by the Wildlife Division, and there was a lot of back and forth last year. I got confused, and it was a mistake to accept that language. It should have been last year, which you all approved, was no hunting on the Wood River drainage on the national forest. And I apologize for my confusion.
Any more questions, Ms. Rumsey?
Mr. President,
Yes, Ms. President.
I'm just curious, is it all hunting that's pushing them away? Or there are wolves in there, a lot of traffic on that road? Are there other factors other than the hunting? That's why people aren't seeing the moose along the road, because the numbers indicate they're still in the area.
There was a wolf killed right before Christmas across the river. I heard the shots when I was out walking the dogs. There's some bears in that area. There's climate issues. Moose are heat stressed at 57 degrees Fahrenheit. There's logging that's just about to finish up. It was supposed to be done last year. We still have about 15 acres left, and there's a few other smaller projects. There used to be a lot more moose than there are now, and with all the wolves, the bears, the climate issues, the parasites and other diseases they're facing, potentially chronic wasting disease as well, there's no sense pushing it too far. So yes, there are other issues why people may not be seeing them, but they used to be a lot more than there are now.
You know, Mary, you blame the parasites and other things, but the number one contributing factor for the decline in the wolf population, the moose population is depredation. It's not man, and it's not parasites. It is the wolf, and it is the grizzly. During calving season, they take their share of calves like no other. And so I'm going to stand firm on that.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Any other call to public about Chapter 8 moose hunting? Okay. What's your pleasure?
So, Mr. President, I guess I would like to have the department address some of Mary's concerns. First of all, can you point out to us on that map where in Area 9 the Wood River is? I'm not sure I understand exactly where it's at, and can you... Can you also reiterate the total population in that area and the Wood River population for us?
Yeah, so the next, once we get this presentation set up. Mr. President, members of the Commission, and Commissioner Culver, so the Cody region folks have been, as Mary said, they've been putting out cameras and looking to see the density of moose or the presence of moose in different portions of that hunt area. So Area 9 runs south out from the Cody area, and then 11 is up here, and then 8 is the thoroughfare, and 8 was closed around the time the rest of the Teton Wilderness was closed. And so the following last year with Mary's comments, Mary began working with Bart a little bit closer, and Bart had been doing some monitoring in that drainage. And Commissioner Culver, if I miss something to address, just kind of stop me and we can touch on it again.
So.
Okay, so here's the number of moose observed during aerial flight. So this is just the aerial observations, and the managers looked at it from 2005 through 2018, and again, it's pretty rugged. And when those animals are in isolated single, they're either one or two at a time, the detectability is pretty low. But the last 3 years, Bart has been counting from the airplane or helicopter right around 33 moose, and that prior to, there was probably a little less effort, but more consistent the last few years, and he's documenting 30 animals. And then with that, he took a look at the number of moose with trail cameras, and so this is the location of the trail cameras, and I'll show you a couple pictures of the moose that he picked up on the trail cameras. But the Wood River, he picked up 20 animals, and for the total for the hunt area, there was 77 moose within the hunt area. And I mentioned earlier, we want to maintain real high bull ratios, but the problem that you have when you have a really small sample is there's a lot of variability in it. But based on what the region's looking at it within that drainage, it appears that there's, not just the drainage, but the hunt area, there's quite a few animals that are present in that population. And so what Bart looks at when he has a camera set up is the different antler conformation, and as Mary indicated, of course you get a cow in there, there's a little less likelihood that you could identify the individual animal, but based on the positioning and the timing of those observation, Bart kind of weeded out a lot of those duplications, and that's where he came up with the 77 moose within that hunt area. And then here's a couple other shots of those animals from different camera locations. And so it is it's our contention that when you look at that draft regulation that's before you, we deleted that language that said off national forest from the regulation, because it's mostly private land, and most of those hunters don't really go to the private land anyway. But we do not support, from a department standpoint, we don't support restricting portions of public land to hunting. And I would refer to some of the Cody guys, but the numbers of animals being harvested within that drainage, there's a concern raised by the public, but overall, with 5 licenses, there's not, from our standpoint, there's not a population concern that we are, I guess that we're not really worried to that level that the public is, because of the numbers that we're seeing on the cameras and throughout the drainages within the Wood River Drainage and adjacent to there.
Doug, Mr. President, how many moose were taken on the Wood River last year?
3.
3?
3.
Okay.
How many tags for, excuse me, Mr. President, how many tags?
5 tags.
And these are bulls only.
Mr. President, members of the commission, yes, that's correct.
One more comment. Mary, I really truly do appreciate your passion. I do. I'm not sure there's a compromise here, but I don't fully agree with the practice of road hunting, but I'm not sure where to go from there. I don't think anybody in this room approves of road hunting, but so therefore I understand what you're talking about.
Those are public roads, correct?
The public roads, Mr. President, members of the commission, and there's continues to be a real high demand, as we talked about earlier, with a lot of these license types, and if I remember correctly, it was just over 150 people put in for those type. Those 5 licenses last year, and so, and actually what's put in this February is the application period. So there still continues to be a real high demand for it, and from a population standpoint, the region doesn't believe that 5 licenses in that entire hunt area is going to cause any kind of detriment to that population.
Any other questions? Comments? Entertain a motion for chapter 8.
So moved.
No, go ahead, you make it. What's your motion?
Motion that we approve the department's
Chapter
recommendation on chapter 8.
Moved by Mr. Royale. And a second. Ms. Byrd. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Chapter 8 passes as presented.
So moving on, next chapter is Mr. President, members of the commission, is chapter 15, bison, the wild bison seasons. And I guess I'll just give a little precursor to that. Chapter 15 last year was kind of a tough year for us. We had weather events that kind of precluded those animals from moving onto their typical wintering habitats, and so the hunters had a little more difficult time achieving a harvest. Oh, actually, I'm on chapter 9. All right, so we'll go chapter 9 first. So statewide.
So we're doing sheep, okay.
Yep. Got ahead of myself. So bighorn sheep, looking at the different regions. Jackson region had a decline of 1 license for this year. Cody, a decline of 6 licenses. Sheridan, Green River, not applicable. Laramie increased 2 licenses, and Lander -2 licenses. Casper +1, and Pinedale -2 licenses. And the statewide, that change there was, now this thing's pretty sensitive. Type 1 licenses statewide, we decreased to 8 licenses. 2017, the harvest was 175 sheep, and it was 83% success. Common themes raised throughout the public meeting process. There was really nothing, other than the concerns we heard at the last commission meeting regarding the Whiskey Mountain sheep. We have changes that were subsequent to the public comment, none. And then the merging issues and the ongoing is that Whiskey Mountain bighorn sheep and the factors influencing that population's recruitment. And then from a statewide standpoint, we continue to be concerned about the mountain goat expansion that is occurring in a couple of these herd units, including Area 6, which I think we've talked to Commissioner Schmid, we've talked a little bit about that, and then some of the areas around Cody with some of the goat expansion there. And so the harvest trend, of course, it kind of managed pretty conservatively, but we harvested just at 170 sheep last year. And with that, that concludes the Chapter 8 presentation, and the department recommends that the commission adopt the regulation Chapter 8 as proposed.
Go ahead, Mr. Rail.
Doug, why is the expansion happening with the mountain goat? Is it just territorial? Is it just moving out?
Mr. President and members of the commission and Commissioner Rail, it's kind of all of the above. They're fairly aggressive. They utilize habitats a little bit differently, but they've been shown to kind of be a more of an aggressive user of their space, and so there's concern that way. In addition, they do harbor a lot of the same pathogens that in the past have been linked to bighorn die-offs, and so the densities of mountain goats are a concern when they share some of those same habitats. So spatially, because of the use of resources and because of potential for disease transmission.
Obviously, the population's increasing too, I guess, huh?
That's correct, yeah.
How soon do you think you're going to have an answer from wasn't one proposal to move some of those mountain goats, or?
So Grand Teton National Park does have an environmental review process in place that they're going through right now, and there's been several options discussed, and at this point Grand Teton is looking at like I said, a number of alternatives, but they're monitoring. They put some radio collars out. They're trying to do some genetics, and they're trying to look at distribution, habitat use, find out exactly what those animals are using, and then they're going to come up forward some alternatives here. I think they're probably here in the near future they'll have some kind of document out with the options. And then that's why the department was supportive of the legislation for the general mountain goat license, and that would be something that we would use adjacent to Grand Teton National Park. And I think there was discussion about that earlier, that if we could institute that right away would be beneficial, but I think people need to realize that the distribution of those mountain goats is it's limited to the majority of it is in Grand Teton National Park, so the control of that portion of the goat population falls within the National Park Service's hands. But if we have animals that do come up onto the national forest off of Teton Creek or off of the divide with the park, next year we're looking at having some options in place to have a general mountain goat season in places like that to address that distribution.
All right, Mr. Rail?
Doug, how's the Seminole herd doing? I mean, haven't heard much about it.
So Seminole herd, looking at we've been supplementing that transplant, and the population's been doing really well. I think Daryl's here, and I will defer to Daryl to give you a quick update.
President Anselmi, members of the commission, Director Talbot, I'm happy to report that the Seminole transplants have been hugely successful. We've collared almost all of those sheep, and their survival has been incredibly high. Lamb production's been outstanding, and we estimate that we're probably in the neighborhood of around 250 sheep. We've got an objective of 300, so we may be looking at bringing that objective to you in the near future and perhaps increasing it. We are doing some habitat evaluations to ensure that any more increases in the Seminoles is appropriate, but they're doing well.
Great news.
So you're the head of the mule deer initiative too, right?
Say it again.
Aren't you the department lead on the mule deer? So do the same thing with the mule deer that you just did with those sheep, and we'll be in good shape.
Well, we're working in that direction.
Anybody from the public would like to address Chapter 9 Bighorn sheep? All right, any more questions of Doug?
Mr. President?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Doug, do you know how many rams were taken in Area 8 last year off the top of your head? You know what the harvest success was?
I do not.
Okay. I was just-
We can get that, though.
Okay, thanks.
Any other, do they have that? Okay.
Mr. President, Commissioner Smith, it was 6.
So 50% of the tax last year, okay.
Any more questions of Doug? Comments? Is the motion to approve Chapter 9 for me?
Mr. President, I motion we approve Chapter 9 as recommended by the department.
Moved by Mr. Rayo. Second. Second by Mr. Doobie. Discussion? All in favor of approving Chapter 9 as presented?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. All right, do we want to go to lunch or go to lunch?
Good idea.
So at 1:30, we'll be back. Thank you.